Les exposés de M. Tarek Mitri et de son Excellence M. Eugène Richard Gazana, représentant permanent du Rwanda en sa qualité de président du comité du Conseil de sécurité créé par la résolution 1970. Je donne maintenant la parole à M. Tarek Mitri.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. You have before you the report of the Secretary General on Libya, covering events in that country since his last report on September 5th, 2013. On March 8th, Libyan oil was loaded on a North Korean flagged vessel called the Morning Glory by armed groups who have been blockading a number of oil terminals and fields in eastern Libya for many months. This constitutes an illegal act and violates Libya's sovereignty over its ports and natural resources. 3 months ago, before this council, I spoke of the steady decline in the security situation across Libya and of mounting popular frustration with the political process. I alluded to the strong polarization resulting from disagreement over the management of the transition period, reflecting deeper political and ideological divisions. On 2nd March, the General National Congress building was stormed by protesters demanding its dissolution. About 150 young men ransacked the main chamber and assaulted members, 4 of whom were injured. I strongly condemned violence against the General National Congress members and premises, re-emphasizing the need to respect legitimate state institutions while upholding the right to freedom of expression. I also made it clear that the use of force to achieve political objectives is to be unequivocally rejected. The decision of the General National Congress on 3rd of February regarding the transfer of its authority in due course to a constitutionally elected legislative body did not diffuse tensions ahead of 7th of February, the date some have interpreted controversially as that on which the GNC's term should have ended. Acknowledging public pressure, this body opted for early elections, establishing de facto a new transitional period, a 3rd transitional period, to continue until the end of a longer constitutional process. It has formed a 15-members committee to consider amendments to the constitutional declaration issued by the National Transitional Council in August 2011. Intense efforts to resolve differences and negotiate an agreement on the management of the transitional period, including the future of the General National Congress and the government, have not succeeded in bringing an end to the divisions that have paralyzed the political process. Considerable differences remain over holding both parliamentary and presidential elections and the extent of powers to be granted to a future president. The application of the political isolation law remains a contentious issue as well. Throughout this process, the United Nations Support Mission in Libya has constantly encouraged the different parties to reach agreement on the main national priorities and the management of the transition. To this effect, I convened regular consultative meetings with leaders of the major political and civil society forces. Madam President, in the previous 3 months, there has been a dramatic increase in violence across the country. In January and early February, clashes took place in the Warshafana area west of Tripoli, within earshot of UNSMIL's compound. In Sabha in the south, and in Kufra in the southeast, political, economic, and social grievances spilled over into armed violence between rival groups, many along ethnic and tribal lines. Former regime supporters took advantage of the situation to occupy, for some time, government facilities. In Sabha, violence resulted in over 100 fatalities, including children and the elderly. It also led to the displacement of hundreds of families and shortage of fuel, food, and medical supplies. In coordination with the national and local authorities, the United Nations moved quickly to provide displaced families in Aubari and Sabha with emergency relief items. Providing relief items to Kufra is also underway. In the east, the unabated campaign of targeted assassinations, bombings, and abductions has reached intolerable levels. Many victims have been security and judicial personnel. But civilians also have suffered unchecked terror and intimidation. The killing in Benghazi on 24th of February of 7 Egyptian nationals, all Christians, are a sad illustration of the dangerous lawlessness. I take heart from the unequivocal condemnation and repulsion with which the Libyan public and leaders have reacted to these killings. In a city, Benghazi, which prides itself on its role in putting an end to decades of tyrannical rule, the present public sense of anger is mounting. While the primary responsibility of reining in the perpetrators of this ugly campaign of terror lies with the state, this will only be possible with the concerted efforts by the government, political, civic, and revolutionary forces aiming at the protection of the civilian population. I must say that in this context, the United Nations was criticized for what is seen as its impotence by those whose expectations are far beyond what the UN mission is mandated to do by way of protection of the civilian population. Madame la Présidente, nationwide demonstrations have taken place since early February against the continued tenure of the General National Congress. Strong resentment and animosity has grown between the two main, though not homogeneous, camps. Libya faces the risk of embarking on a new trajectory of unprecedented violence. On February 18th, two armed brigades gave an ultimatum to Congress members to step down within 5 hours or face military intervention. This escalation followed a series of attacks against media outlets that have strongly disapproved of the General National Congress. In my contacts with political and brigade leaders, as well as in a public statement, I call for restraint, warned against resorting to violence, and appealed for a return to political dialogue. In a meeting with the two brigades, I reiterated this position, asking them to resolve political problems by political means. It is widely believed that UNSMIL had a role in helping to avert violence on this occasion. It is regrettable, however, that some voices of criticism or even slander failed to recognize the true motives and the effects of the UN initiatives. Mindful of our neutrality and respect of national sovereignty, as well as our strict adherence to non-interference in the internal affairs of Libya, I persistently called on all actors on Libyan scene to uphold the national interest and refrain from threatening to use force to resolve political disputes. I also reiterated the United Nations support to the safeguarding of the legitimacy of Libya's elected institutions and their role in a peaceful transfer of authority to an elected body. Madam President, on February 20th, the Constitution Drafting Assembly elections took place. 649 candidates contested the elections. 54 women competed for the 6 reserved seats. 500,000 voters cast their ballots, representing 46% of 1,100,541 registered voters. So 1 million Libyans registered voters this time around. There were 2.7 million in 2012. In addition to the Amazigh boycott of the polls, there was a sizable boycott by the Tabu and Tuareg in the south. Their stance relates to their demand for a consensual decision-making mechanism in the Constitution Drafting Assembly regarding their rights. There had to be a rerun of the polls on February 26 in about 2% of centers. In some of them, polling did not take place because of the boycott. Security considerations in the city of Derna meant that no polling took place there. A total of 13 seats out of 60 from across Libya have not been filled. Madame la Présidente, there had been an alarming increase in attacks on journalists and media institutions. Several television stations in Tripoli and Benghazi were the target of armed acts of vandalism. A number of journalists and media figures were abducted. Attacks on media outlets and personnel were and must be condemned. In February, the General National Congress promulgated a law which punishes with imprisonment any person found to be undermining the 17th February revolution or publicly insulting the legislative, executive, or judicial authorities or disgracing the national flag. The law was criticized by many Libyans as incompatible with Libya's constitutional declaration and its international human rights obligations. We've called upon the General National Congress to bring the law in line with the international human rights standards. On March the 2nd, the 90 days deadline set by the law on transitional justice for completing the screening of detainees expired. Initial figures suggest that the process has yet to be completed. UNSMIL remains concerned at reports of continuing torture, death in custody, kidnapping, and secret detentions by brigades nominally affiliated to the Ministries of Justice or Defense. The handover of all detainees to the effective control of the state is a prerequisite to the establishment of the rule of law in the country. Madame la Présidente, strengthening the state's ability to assume its security responsibilities continues to be hindered by the absence of a political agreement over the rebuilding of a national army, the integration of revolutionary fighters, and the collection of weapons. A solution to this problem will require a clear strategy and giving a number of assurances to the revolutionaries who are only nominally under state authority. These include recognition of their contributions to the revolution and safeguards for their legitimate rights and interests. Despite a number of systemic problems, efforts by the United Nations persevere. In addition to advice and technical assistance, there has been special attention given to developing national programs to control arms and ammunition stockpiles, heavy weapons, and small arms, as well as light weapons. I'm pleased to report that the government has responded positively and taken steps to create a structure to address these issues. Madam President, international and well-coordinated support to Libya is vital. In this regard, I welcome the holding and the results of the Rome Conference on March 6th, with the participation of a large number of countries, including the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, neighboring countries, and other friends of Libya. The people of Libya expect that the international community will assist them in the difficult task of building a state with strong and accountable institutions. Support to Libya, however, can be meaningful and effective if there is unequivocal commitment on the part of Libya's leaders to this goal, and a political will to resolve, through dialogue and concerted efforts, the major problems of the country. Je vous remercie, Madame la Présidente.
Je remercie M. Mitri pour son exposé et je donne maintenant la parole à son Excellence M. Eugène Richard Gazana.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, in accordance with